Hey, what's up you guys, the Curious Owl here, and today I'm going to be sharing my thoughts with you on The Fires of Heaven by Robert Jordan. So just a quick little note before I start, the windows in this room are open because it is very warm right now, so if you hear stuff from outside, that is why. Fires of Heaven is the 5th book in the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan, so this review is going to contain spoilers in terms of things that are happening in this book and in terms of establishing context within the rest of the books leading up to this. Basically go into what the main synopsis of this is we have two main plot lines. The first of which being that Rand al'Thor, the Dragon Reborn, the person that is basically destined to bring down the Dark One, has been chasing down this group of Aiel, which are called the Shido. They're basically a group of people that in the Aiel world are completely against Rand. They do not believe that he is this savior, and they believe that he is, if anything, more of a bad guy. And in order to basically have control of the Aiel and make sure that he has a strong enough army in order to go face the Dark One later on down the line, he does have to basically go and fight these people who are pretty much just not great people. They're basically already trying to attack him and the people he cares about, so he's basically having to start this war with them. Additionally, we have the perspectives of Nynaeve, Almira, and Elaine Trakand, who basically are characters we've known throughout most of this series by now. Nynaeve having been a former wisdom or healer of sorts turned Aes Sedai, and Elaine Trakand having been the daughter heir of Andor and also turned Aes Sedai, or at the very least novices of a sort. And they have been on the lam of trying to find a rebel group of Aes Sedai called the Black Aja. They are basically a group of women who are in favor of the Dark One. They work for the Dark One in some capacity, and for the last couple of books they've basically been working on trying to figure out where these women are and how to stop them, because they have a massive amount of power in terms of possibly bringing down Rand. While on this journey, they end up basically joining what's called a menagerie, or essentially basically like a circus, or in some cases maybe freak show act, by a man called Valen Luca. He is basically hiding them. They are hiding their identities because along these travels they do realize that they have to be careful because the rebel Aes Sedai are actually in some way coming after them, and so they have to hide their identities and hide out in this menagerie in order to gain the information they need before they can make their next move. I will say right off the bat, this is so far my least favorite book in the entire series. I gave this 2 stars in terms of my rating, and I'll get into a lot of my dislikes for it in a little bit, but the main thing was I felt that this book really didn't seem to pick up at all until probably the last 100 pages. Saying that though, that is one of the things I really did like about this book, is that the last 100 pages were the most interesting aspect of this. I feel that they really had a lot of great reveals and twists that had come up that I think are going to be really interesting to look at in terms of what goes on in the next book, Lord of Chaos, and the rest of the books going into this series. But that was pretty much the only thing I really cared about in terms of the entire plot of the story. This does, in a lot of ways, I think, suffer from middle book syndrome, where because there's so much that has to be done in terms of building up the story, there was a lot to be left to be desired, and really there was only 1 or 2 instances in terms of battles that were really interesting to look at. Now, in terms of some other things I really did seem to like, so the character of Mat Cauthon, who has been a friend of Rand's that we've seen throughout the entirety of this series, was originally looked at as a possibility for the Dragon Reborn, but turned out wasn't, and instead has turned out to be actually kind of more of a general of sorts. He basically is kind of the right-hand man of what we know as the myth, the legend of Lews Therin, who was the Dragon Reborn previously, that Rand is essentially the reincarnation of. We learn that Mat is basically the reincarnation of one of Lews Therin's followers, one of his battle masters in a sense. And so basically though, what we do see though is with Mat is this kind of need to do things on his own, but there's this kind of inner battle that goes on with him about that, because he doesn't want to abandon Rand. He knows that he has a part to play in this whole thing, but he's kind of in the same spot Rand was when it came to coming to terms with being the Dragon Reborn, where he doesn't want to fully admit that that is what's happening to him. So he does decide that he wants to kind of possibly go his own way at the beginning of this, which I find very refreshing for Matt as a character, because Matt up until this point really doesn't seem to have much ambition, doesn't really seem to have much going for him other than kind of being like along for the ride. And so I really appreciate how in this book and in the last book, The Shadow Rising, we really seem to get a lot of character development for him and seeing a lot of kind of the inner demons that he's been dealing with kind of on the side. Now, there are a couple things that I'm going to mention in terms of spoilers for this, like I said, because there are two specific deaths that bring in that may or may not really be deaths, but that includes the death of Morgase, Elaine's mother, and we learned that there's basically a big plot in terms of that's going to kind of go into things later on in the story. Essentially what we learn is that Morgase is thought to be dead, but she's actually not. There is a chapter at the very end that does indicate that her death has been fake, and that's because there's a lot of things going on in her world that are causing a lot of problems. There's basically somebody who's been out to get her, basically out to use her as a pawn, and when she catches on to that, she realizes that she has to kind of move away from all of this stuff and really kind of get outside of what is going on in order to then find a way to weasel herself back into power. I really like that because I think it's going to be a very interesting way to look at how, kind of from an outside perspective, how things are happening. And I'm curious to see how exactly she does weave her way back into things, because we don't know how long it's going to be before she's able to. And then how is that going to affect Elaine later on, who doesn't even know that her mother supposedly is dead? In addition to that, we have the death of Moiraine, who is our main Aes Sedai throughout most of this, the person who really found Rand in the first place. And I'm going to say it's kind of more of a possible death because we really don't know what exactly happened. There's a scene here where a character, Lanfear, that we've known since about book 2 or 3 basically, who's kind of been this almost villain. She's one of the Forsaken, but was also Lews Therin's lover back in the past, who has been kind of seeking out Rand and trying to recruit him in a sense to join the Dark One. She essentially, after finding out that Rand slept with a character, namely Aviendo, which I'll get to in a minute. And in this moment of heated tension, Moiraine basically shoves herself and Lanfear through this gate that supposedly nobody ever comes back from. And so everyone assumes that Moiraine is now dead. And I actually really did like how this was done, because we've known throughout some of the books that Moiraine is kind of expecting something to happen to her. She's expecting that she will die at some point in this journey, and she doesn't know exactly when, but she has told Lan, her warder, that if she does die, he is to go to become the warder of somebody else, and it's a way for him to not then be able to avenge Moraine's death. She does not want Lan to try to avenge her death. She wants him to just be able to go move on, because there are more important things to do than sit around and try to plot revenge on her death when that's not something she wants. So I think that the way that her death was done was very quick and over with. It was very much to her character. It's honestly one of the best character deaths I have seen, because it is very true to how Moiraine, I think, would have wanted to go out. Now to go into some of the dislikes I have with this. First of all, like I said, this was super, super slow. This definitely suffers from that middle book syndrome I was talking about earlier, where a lot of times in order to basically further the plot, there's a lot of kind of slow parts. There's not really a lot of action. It's a lot more build up. And like I said, pretty much a lot of the things that were very interesting was the last 100 pages. There was, one particular battle scene that was really interesting that did deal with the part of the synopsis of Rand's story, like I said, where he's going to fight off this other Aiel tribe in order to take control of all of the Aiel, essentially. And that was, beside the last 100 pages, the most interesting part of this entire story. So I felt like it was a lot of just boring, monotonous kinds of things that I didn't really feel like I connected with, or that I could really give you any clear indication of what happened, because not a lot seemed to. Throughout this too, with Nynaeve and Elaine's perspectives, Nynaeve is very whiny, more so than I've ever seen her in any of these books. She's been portrayed in the past as this very kind of calm, collected, no-nonsense character, and almost this entire book, she is just beside herself. She basically goes through this very traumatic experience where she nearly dies in this space called Teleron Riod, which basically is like a dream walk state where people who are able to use this space are able to not only see things as they're happening in the real world, even if they are not currently in that area or that space, but they are also then able to access other dream states, essentially, where they can manipulate things. It's very much kind of like lucid dreaming, if you will. And unfortunately, Nynaeve, like I said, goes through a very traumatic incident in the beginning of her story here, where she nearly is killed by this character named Mogadine, who is basically one of the Forsaken that is kind of leading the charge of the Black Aja and the rebel Aes Sedai. And it causes Nynaeve, I think, to have massive PTSD, which I totally understand. That by itself is one thing I will say I don't necessarily mind in terms of her whining and complaining. But it's the fact that throughout most of this, Nynaeve doesn't do anything to help herself. She doesn't do anything to really make it seem like she's nothing other than just a scared little girl. I will say again that this is the first time she's ever really had to deal with something like this, so I understand, and from a PTSD standpoint, like why this was so hard for her. But there was a lot of like kind of self-defeated nature that I feel like could have been fought against if she was even willing to face it. It's not until like the very, very end of this that we see she actually stands up for herself and is actually able to take charge of something. I don't know, something about the way Nynaeve was portrayed here I think was not done well, and I feel like she could have been represented a little bit differently to show how much more of a strong character she is. I feel like that everything that happened to her in this, in terms of her whining and complaining about how she's not strong enough, how she's all this and how she's not this, and all of this mooning over, you know, various men, including Lan, who we've known since the beginning, it's not indicative of her character. It's very outside of what I believe Nynaeve to be as a person, and so it was very irritating to see a lot of how this story was for her. And one of the last things I will say about in terms of my dislikes is this very romantic connection there is between Rand and Avienda, who is one of the Aiel, who was basically recruited by Elaine to protect him and keep him from basically turning against Elaine and basically not being her boyfriend. Like, Avienda's whole role throughout protecting Rand was not only to just actually protect him as like a warrior, but also to make sure he didn't sleep with somebody else that was not Elaine. And yet she ended up sleeping with him. And it's like this really weird thing. I found it to be very bizarre, and it was very much a one-night stand kind of thing, as opposed to it being a long-lasting relationship. But it's a one-night stand, and then it is a lot of like sexual tension throughout most of the rest of this book after that point. Now, what I will say is that this does make sense to a certain degree, because one of our characters, Min, has the gift of sight, and she does see that Rand has 3 women who are involved with him at some point in this series. Now, Min doesn't necessarily know who the third person is in this trio, but she does know that she and Elaine are both meant to be tied to him in some kind of romantic essence, like wives of some kind or something like that. But they don't really know who this third person is. I am willing to believe it is Avienda that is this third person, because there's been a lot of things that have been built up in this story that makes me think she is this warrior character, and there is this kind of unexplained tie that she believes she has to him. I also would not be surprised if it is somebody else that we'll meet sometime later in this storyline, but I don't know, for some reason she does fit, I feel like, that role. But it was just very strange, I think, in any case, to have her sleep with him, because she supposedly is very close with Elaine, and she's been trying so hard to keep Rand from sleeping with other women. So it just seemed very out of character, I think, in terms of Avienda as a person, to just randomly sleep with Rand and then act as if nothing is gonna come of that. Like, I think Elaine's gonna find out what happened and she's gonna be rightfully pissed. I would have preferred if this was to happen, where Avienda is this third person, that it would be brought up when all 3 of the girls that he supposedly has this romantic tie with would be together, but I guess that's not what was meant to happen. So that's really all I can say with the Fires of Heaven. I feel like I had a lot more issues with it than I did things I enjoyed, and so it's definitely not my most favorite. I think this is so far, like I said, the least favorite of the books in this series. I feel like that this is just kind of par for the course. I'm getting to the middle of this series where typically books in especially long-standing series like this are kind of subpar compared to books that are more in the beginning and more at the end. So I don't know exactly what to think about this, but I am hoping that the next book, Lord of Chaos, ends up being a little bit better. So with that being said though, let's go into the synopsis for Lord of Chaos and go through some things that I would like to hopefully see, or things I might be pretty excited for when it comes to this. So I have a synopsis here from Goodreads, and it says, on the slopes of Sheol Gul, the Murdril swords are forged, and the sky is not the sky of this world. In Saladar, the White Tower in exile prepares an embassy to Cainlan, where Randall Thor, the Dragon Reborn, holds the throne, and where an unexpected visitor may change the world. In Emond's Field, Perrin Goldeneyes, Lord of the Two Rivers, feels the pull of Tyviran to Taviran and prepares to march. Morgaze of Cainlan finds a most unexpected and quite unwelcome ally, and south lies Ilion, where Samael holds sway. So first and foremost, the fact that we're going to have Perrin return in this next book is astounding, because he was never brought up in terms of a perspective here in the Fires of Heaven. There were some thoughts about maybe what he could be doing, but nobody had really heard much about what had happened in Emond's Field that we learned about in The Shadow Rising, where he basically saved the day. And so I'm very excited to see what exactly happens with him, because he is one of my more favorite characters in this series. The second thing I would like to see is, when exactly do Nynaeve and Elaine bring in themselves to meet up with Rand, because Nynaeve does play a large role in the final battle scene of the Fires of Heaven and helping out Rand, but she's not physically in proximity to him. So when do she and Elaine end up meeting up with Rand? In addition to that, in this final battle scene, Egwene actually got really badly injured, and so I'm curious to see what's going to happen, because she is in a lot of ways kind of this messenger to Nynaeve and Elaine in the Teleron Riod. She's able to meet with them there and tell them of what's going on. So what is going to happen to her while she's injured? Is she going to experience other things that are going to be kind of outside of the norm? Is she even going to be able to meet with Nynaeve and Elaine? Is that what's going to basically get them to go to where Rand is in Cainlan? Also, are we going to still see Lan at all in the next book? Because now that Moiraine is supposedly dead and Lan is off to basically join up with the person that he is now the warder of, are we going to see anything from him? Are we going to see his perspective of things? Are we going to have him join back up with this group? I have no idea. I'm curious to see whether or not Lan is going to play a big role in this story anymore, now that basically he's been sent off to do something else. And finally, what is Matt going to do? Now that he's kind of really cemented his role in this entire thing, is he going to stay with Rand? Is he going to stick around, or is he going to still try to go out on his own like he had tried to here in the Fires of Heaven? The plans with that kind of were foiled with the first big battle scene that happened with facing off against the Shido, and so I don't know whether or not he's going to still want to at this point now after this final battle scene. But let me know what your guys' thoughts were on the Fires of Heaven if you read it yourself. Did you feel like it kind of suffered from middle book syndrome like I did? I feel like I may possibly have an unpopular opinion with this. Also, if you have any thoughts that you would like to share about Lord of Chaos that are non-spoilery for me, please feel free to let me know down in the comments below. I'd love to hear what your guys' thoughts were on that if you've read it yourself, and if you feel like it definitely brings up the story at any point, if the book 5 was kind of the middle book syndrome book of the series. But if you guys did enjoy this video, please do give it a big thumbs up. And if you haven't already and you'd like to be and would like to see more content like this, go ahead and hit that button down below and subscribe to become an owlet in our flock. And I will see all of you guys in my next video. Bye guys.